assists in a panel presentation regarding genetically modified organisms. Each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes to present before we open the floor for questions from the audience. Our first panelist, Dr. Robert Jones, is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Applied and Professional Ethics at California State University, Chico. Dr. Jones earned his master's degree in philosophy from California State University, Los Angeles, and his PhD in philosophy from Stanford University, where he was subsequently first a lecturer and then a postdoctoral fellow. While at Stanford, Professor Jones also taught at De Anza College. In fact, I'm particularly pleased to say, Professor Jones has a considerable history of teaching at a number of California community colleges. His accomplishments teaching are matched by his other contributions to the profession. His review of Tsaki Zamir's Ethics and the Beast is, for example, forthcoming in Ethics in Review. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Jones, who will speak to us this morning on the ethics of genetically modified animals.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, and thanks for that nice introduction. I didn't know who you were talking about with all those things. I don't recognize this. I'd like to focus today on the issue of the ethics of genetically modified animals, but focusing in particular with regard to the issues of food, because it's a wide field, because animals are genetically modified for many different reasons. But I want to focus just on the food issue, and also I want to focus mostly on the transference of genes, because genetic modification can take place in a lot of different ways. The way that we use selective breeding is in some sense a genetic modification. So I'm not going to address that either. I just want to focus specifically on food animals and specifically on gene transference as the method of genetic modification. And what I'd like to do is to just give you a little lay of the land, a little background on the kinds of ways and the kinds of things that philosophers think about when they think about the ethics of genetically modified animals for food. So the first thing I want to lay out is a kind of a broad distinction that philosophers speak of with regard to the ethics of this issue, and that is the idea of wrongness. So there's a feeling that genetically altering animals for many reasons, but specifically for food, there's kind of an intuition that there's something wrong with that. Many people feel that there's something wrong with changing the genes or transferring genes from one organism to another, and these are frankenfoods, and it's kind of scary. But to weed through those kinds of intuitions and get to what are the issues precisely that are on the table when we say that there's something ethically questionable, something maybe morally wrong with genetic modification of animals. And so to kind of clarify that and answer that question, philosophers sort of narrowed this question down into types of wrongness. So basically, here's the way it works. There are what we call intrinsic wrongnesses and extrinsic wrongnesses with genetic modification. The genetic engineering of a living organism may, for a variety of reasons, be thought of as being morally problematic in itself. For example, genetic engineering may be perceived as morally wrong due to the mode of production or the source of the genetic material, and this is classified as an intrinsic problem, intrinsically wrong. So you might say, for example, that it's just wrong to mess with genes, and that would be an intrinsic claim, a claim about the intrinsic wrongness of the practice. On the other side, we have extrinsic wrongness, so to speak. Genetic engineering may also be thought of as morally problematic because of its consequences. So one might hold the following position. One might say, there's nothing wrong with messing with the genes with a particular animal. That in and of itself is not wrong. What's wrong is it's going to just mess up the environment if we do that. That's where the wrong thing comes out. And that would be an example of an extrinsic wrongness. So philosophers categorize the issue of the wrongness or the immorality or unethicality of genetic modification of animals as either intrinsic or extrinsic. And what that means is, if you meet a person and they say, it's just wrong to genetically modify animals, and you press them on that, and you sort of extract what their reasons are, by most accounts, it'll probably fit into the intrinsic or the extrinsic. So it's not just an account that has been created by philosophers in the abstract. It's an account that has been sort of distilled from people's arguments. Okay, so now we lay that on the table. What I want to do is give you some examples of the kinds of arguments that people use to argue against genetically modifying food organisms, particularly animals. And I'm just going to give an example from the intrinsic side and then an example from the extrinsic side. And I'm sure most of you have heard these kinds of arguments before, but I'm hoping to just clarify for you, to give you some kind of framework that when you engage this kind of discussion, you engage questions of the ethics of genetically modified food animals, you'll understand how to categorize it. Maybe hopefully it'll help you to get a little clearer on it. So there are two arguments, and I'm just going to lay these out and not go through them quickly, given the time constraints. The first argument, the first kind of intrinsic argument, basically comes down to this. In a nutshell, you could characterize intrinsic arguments against genetic modification as this. It's unnatural to genetically engineer plants, animals, and foods. That's sort of the heart of the intrinsic argument. It's just not natural. How does that sort of flesh out? Well, I'm just going to talk about quickly two arguments that fall under that category that are very common that you hear. One is called, I call it, or it's in the literature, it's not actually called, but one's the playing God argument, and the other one is it's against nature argument. So these are intrinsic arguments that are very popular with philosophers. The playing God argument says basically this. It's unethical to transfer genes from one species to another species. This attitude is sometimes grounded in a religious belief that humankind should not violate boundaries set by God. And so this line of reasoning is often referred to, as I said, as the playing God argument. According to this view, any, quote, redesigning of nature through the insertion of new genes is morally unacceptable. If one accepted the playing God argument, this would entail an unconditional rejection of the genetic modification of farm animals. And by farm animals, I'm including aquaculture, I'm including fish. The reason why is because the fish industry is actually on the forefront, the cutting edge of genetic modified food animals is fish, aquaculture. The two basic assumptions in the playing God argument are these. God has drawn up invisible boundaries within the realm of humans and the realm of God, and those who transcend this boundary are guilty. That's bad. Okay. So there are a lot of ways to go with this, but let me just mention a couple of kinds of responses that philosophers think about. The results of selective breeding and the results of recombinant DNA techniques are actually on par. So if you say humans should not be messing around with what God made, then recombinant DNA and selective breeding are both messing around with what God has made. So what philosophers want to say is, well, to be consistent, we really can't use selective breeding if we believe in the playing God argument. So that raises a problem for the playing God argument. If the source species of the inserted genetic information were ethically relevant, then we would need an account of what the ethically relevant differences are between genetic information from a distant species, genetic information obtained from the same species, and genetic information that occurs through natural mutation. There does not seem to be a plausible candidate here for this argument. In other words, you're taking this DNA stuff and you're putting it from this animal to this animal, and the claim is that's wrong. And the argument or the challenge is, What is it about that particular stuff, those 4 chemicals that make up the DNA strand? What is it intrinsically about those that makes it wrong to move that chemical to that entity? There's not really a clear account of that. Let me just say last on this particular issue, transgenic animals can create particular problems for some religious groups. For example, Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus, it would be forbidden to eat foods containing genetic material from animals whose flesh is forbidden. Such religious requirements raise fundamental questions about the identity of animals and its genetic basis. If, for example, a small amount of genetic material from a fish is introduced into a melon in order to allow it to grow at lower temperatures, to what extent has the melon become fishy in any meaningful sense? Some would argue that as all living things share a great deal of common genetic material, transferring a gene from an animal to another organism does not involve any incorporation of the animal's identity into that organism, though others would maintain that the transferred genes are precisely those which are distinctive of the animal. So it's not a clear knockdown argument against it. There might be some cases where the playing God argument can have some force, but in general, it's considered kind of an empty argument. Let me quickly just mention the next argument before I move on to the intrinsic. And that is it's against nature argument. And the against nature argument says this. Look, nature is, and all that is natural is valuable. It's good in itself. It has intrinsic value. Modern biotechnology is unnatural because it interferes with nature. It crosses species boundaries. So therefore, modern biotechnology is intrinsically wrong. That's the it's not natural argument. There are 2 problems I will raise, and given our forum, I'm just going to leave them as questions. And let me put the questions out there, and I'll tell you the problem. The first question is, what does natural mean? What does it mean to say that it's unnatural to genetically modify organisms? So what does natural mean? And the second objection to this argument is, what's so good, even if I grant that there's a definition of natural, what's good about natural? Why is natural better than non-natural or artificial? So, I'm not going to discuss it, but I'm going to leave it for you to think about. Try to formulate what you think the word natural means in this case. And then, once you formulate that, try to think of an argument that would conclude from the fact that something is natural that it's good. And if you can do that, then please let me know, because we'll get you published right away, and you will have solved Hume's dilemma. Okay, let me finish by talking about, and I have a couple more minutes. Let me just finish by talking about the extrinsic kinds of arguments. So the intrinsic arguments we see, playing God and it's not natural. What kind of extrinsic arguments are there? Well, this is where I have interest personally, and that is extrinsic arguments deal with risk assessment and animal welfare. So one problem with the extrinsic, with genetically modified organisms, one problem that is raised by the extrinsic argument is, look, the extrinsic argument, just to remind you, it's the one that says, it's okay to mess with the genes, but the results, the consequences are going to be bad. How do you measure that risk? This is an important issue, right? So for example, in aquaculture, with our corporations that modify genes of fish, and some people say if that fish escapes, it's going to ruin the population, it's going to ruin the environment. How do you measure the risk? So that's a giant issue right now in the ethics of genetically modified organisms, is we have to do risk assessment. How do we do that? It's a very complicated task. But given that we have people working on that problem, there are 2 problems. One is animal welfare, and one is the detrimental environmental effects. Now look, here's the issue with animal welfare. There's an intuition we have where it's kind of messed up to make this Frankenstein thing. We genetically modify animals, and it's just an ugly thing, and they look different. Here's what I want to say. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with genetically modifying animals, and here's an example why. And I'm an animal rights, animal welfare guy. It's possible to genetically modify animals so that their lives are better. It's possible to insert a gene that is expressed through some kind of phenotype that makes animals' lives better. Now, if you're not an absolutist about animal rights, if you're a gradualist, if you're saying, well, as long as it's made better, that's a good thing, there's no blanket rejection from an animal welfare perspective of genetic modification. It could actually help. Now, it could harm too, but the point is there's nothing inherently wrong with it from the animal welfare perspective. At least that's my view. And the last thing I'll mention now is the most powerful, I think, argument, extrinsic argument, and that is the detrimental environmental effects. And this I alluded to just a minute ago. This is basically, it's rooted in the fitness of genetically modified animals. And there are three fears that are expressed in this regard. One is called the purge scenario, and that is when you take a genetically modified organism and you put that organism into the wild with its relatives, natural selection will work to purge any trans genes that the wild relatives may inherit. Some transgenic fish may indeed fall under this scenario. It is claimed that this scenario need not be without any long-term effects. In small populations, even temporary declines in net fitness are said to potentially threaten the survival of the population. The second problem is what's called the spread scenario, and this is where the fitness of a transgenic animal is equal or higher to the net fitness of the wild animal. If that's the case, gene flow is likely to go from the transgenic species to the wild species. And this could have a problem for fitness in the wild. And the last thing I want to mention is the scariest example is what's called the Trojan gene scenario. And here's the way that works. There's a gene that we don't know about that is altered in the genetically modified organism. And this is in the case, let me just use an example of fish. You have genetically modified fish. Here's an actual example from a corporation that's modifying salmon. They modify the salmon so the salmon grows 4 times larger than the natural salmon. Turns out that there's a consequence that was unforeseen. Larger salmon mate 4 times more in this particular, it's 25% larger, and it gets 4 times as many matings. What does that mean? It means it's going to produce more offspring if it escapes into the ocean. Here's the problem. The offspring of this particular fish, they're poor, they have low fitness. So in computer models, what happens is you take this large, beautiful, giant, genetically modified fish, you keep it in a pen, it escapes into the wild, it has these phenotypes that draw mates, it reproduces, and its young die. And in computer models, what we find is that in just 20 generations, the species of fish goes extinct. So this is the worst case scenario, the Trojan gene scenario. We release something into the environment and the population disappears. Okay, let me just say one last sentence, one last few ideas, and that are these. I don't think that the intrinsic arguments against the genetic modification of food animals have any force. I think the best arguments against genetic modification of food animals are extrinsic arguments. And I think the strongest arguments against it are detrimental environmental impacts. The risk assessment at this point is unsophisticated. I mean, it's sophisticated, but its predictive power is not that high. And the cost-benefit analysis, the benefit to feeding people versus extinction of species is very great right now. So I think that's the one place to press if you're going to argue against genetically modified organisms for food. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that topic, but thank you for listening and thanks for inviting me.